There was a moment in history when one of the most brilliant minds in technology stood at the edge of what seemed like total failure. Not because he lacked talent, not because he lacked vision, but because of a series of choices, his own and those of others, that collided at the worst possible time. And in that moment, everything he had built, everything he believed in, everything that defined who he was, slipped away from his hands as if it had never truly belonged to him. And that man was Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, a company that started in a garage with nothing more than ambition, curiosity, and an almost obsessive desire to change the world. Yet somehow, years later, that same company would turn around and reject him, pushing him out of the very place he helped create, leaving him not only without a position but without an identity. Because for Jobs, Apple wasn't just a company. It was an extension of himself, a reflection of his ideas, his taste, his intensity, and his relentless pursuit of perfection. And when that was taken away, it wasn't just a professional loss. It was deeply personal. But to understand how such a dramatic fall could happen, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time when Jobs was young, hungry, and driven by a vision that most people couldn't yet see, when computers were cold, complicated machines used only by specialists. And he imagined something completely different, something human, something intuitive, something beautiful. And alongside Steve Wozniak, he began building what would eventually become Apple, a company that didn't just sell technology, but redefined how people interacted with it. And as Apple grew, so did Jobs' reputation as both a genius and a difficult leader, someone who could inspire incredible work but also push people to their limits, someone who demanded excellence at a level that often created tension, because not everyone could keep up with his pace, his expectations, or his vision. And while this intensity played a major role in Apple's early success, it also planted the seeds of future conflict. Because as the company expanded, it needed structure, stability, and experienced leadership, which led to the hiring of John Sculley, a seasoned executive brought in to help guide Apple to the next level. And at first, it seemed like the perfect partnership, a visionary paired with a strategist. But beneath the surface, their differences began to grow, because Jobs wanted to keep pushing boundaries, to take risks, to innovate at any cost, while Scully focused on profitability, control, and maintaining order within a rapidly growing organization. And those two approaches were bound to clash, and when they did, the consequences were massive. Because what started as disagreements turned into power struggles, and what once looked like a strong alliance became a divide that the company could no longer ignore, leading to one of the most shocking decisions in business history when, in 1985, Steve Jobs was effectively removed from Apple, the company he had co-founded, the company that carried his vision, the company that, in many ways, was his life. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, it felt like it was. Because imagine dedicating years of your life to building something meaningful, only to be told that you no longer belong there, that your presence is no longer needed, that your vision is no longer aligned with the future of the company. It's the kind of moment that forces you to question everything, your abilities, your decisions, your worth. And Jobs felt that deeply. He described it as devastating, as a public failure, as something that shook him to his core. And for a time, he didn't know what came next. Because when something becomes your identity and then disappears, you're left with a void that isn't easy to fill. And that's a place many people find themselves in at some point in their lives. That moment where everything seems uncertain, where the path forward isn't clear, where doubt starts to creep in, asking questions you don't want to answer, making you wonder if maybe you weren't as good as you thought, if maybe the failure was your fault, if maybe you should have done things differently. And those thoughts can either break you or push you to rebuild. And for Jobs, after a period of reflection, he chose to rebuild. But not in the same way, not with the same mindset, because failure has a way of changing you, of forcing you to see things from a different perspective. And instead of trying to reclaim what he lost immediately, he started something new. He founded a company called Next, which, while not commercially successful in the traditional sense, became a space for innovation and learning. a place where he could experiment without the same pressures he had faced before. And during this time, he also invested in Pixar, a small animation studio that would go on to revolutionize the film industry, proving that sometimes the most impactful opportunities don't look significant at first. And that's one of the most important lessons in this story, that what seems like a setback can actually open doors you didn't even know existed. Because if Jobs had never been forced out of Apple, he might never have explored these new ventures. He might never have grown in the ways that he did. He might never have developed the perspective that would later define his greatest successes. And as the years passed, Apple began to struggle without him, losing the innovative edge that once made it unique. And eventually, the company found itself in a position where it needed to change, where it needed direction, where it needed the kind of vision that only one person had truly embodied from the beginning. And in a twist that almost feels poetic, that person was Steve Jobs, who returned to Apple in 1997, not as the same man who left, but as someone transformed by experience, by failure, by growth. And what followed was one of the greatest comebacks in history, because under his leadership, Apple didn't just recover, it thrived, introducing products that would reshape entire industries, products that combined technology and design in ways that felt almost inevitable in hindsight, but required incredible vision to create. And it's impossible not to wonder how much of that success was shaped by the years he spent away from the company, by the lessons he learned during his lowest moments, by the choices he made when everything seemed lost. Because that's the real story here. Not just the rise and fall and rise again, but the role that choices play in shaping our lives. The visible ones and the invisible ones, the decisions we make and the ones that are made for us. Because sometimes, the most defining moments aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that disrupt everything. The ones that force us to adapt, to rethink, to grow. And while it's easy to look at Steve Jobs now and see success, it's important to remember that there was a time when his story could have ended very differently. A time when failure seemed like the final chapter, and yet it wasn't. Because he chose to keep going, to keep creating, to keep believing that something meaningful could still come from what he had lost. And that's the part that matters. Because everyone faces moments where things don't go as expected, where plans fall apart, where opportunities disappear. And in those moments, it's easy to focus on what's gone, on what didn't work, on what could have been. But the real question is what comes next, what you choose to do with what's left, how you respond to the situation, because every choice has a cost. Sometimes it's comfort, sometimes it's security. Sometimes it's the illusion of control, but it also has the potential for growth, for transformation, for something greater than what you had before. And maybe that's the deeper meaning behind this story, that the cost of certain choices isn't always negative, even when it feels that way at the time, because what looks like a loss can actually be a redirection. What feels like failure can actually be preparation. And what seems like the end can actually be the beginning of something far more significant than you ever imagined. And if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that your story isn't defined by the moments when everything goes right. It's defined by how you handle the moments when everything goes wrong. Because those are the moments that test you, that shape you, that reveal who you really are. And just like Steve Jobs, you may not understand why certain things happen when they happen. You may not see the purpose behind the setbacks. You may not be able to connect the dots in real time, but that doesn't mean those dots won't connect later. Because one day, when you look back, when you see the bigger picture, you might realize that the thing you once saw as your greatest failure was actually the turning point that led you to where you were meant to be. And that realization changes everything, because it transforms how you see your past, how you approach your present, and how you move toward your future. Understanding that while you can't control every outcome, you can always control your response, your next step, your next decision. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change the direction of your entire life. One choice, made in a moment when it would have been easier to give up. One decision to keep going, to try again, to believe that something better is still possible. Because in the end, it's not the failure that defines you. It's what you do after it. And sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever could.